Good, good morning and welcome to today's very special event discussing trade, sustainability, and a circular economy. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA, and we're delighted to have so many of you join us today from across the United States and around the world. Special thanks to Silverado Policy Accelerator and the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries for sponsoring our series on trade and the environment, and the Plantbased Products Council for sponsoring today's event. Thank you. Before we get to today's event, we want to announce the dates of our 2021 Intensive Trade Seminar. The ITS is a professional development program for those of you who are new to international trade or who want to learn how trade policy is made in the United States. The 2021 ITS will be fully online this year and will take place over 3 days on September 10th, 13th, and 14th. Information can be found on the WITA website at www.wita.org. We also want to remind our longtime WITA supporters that our annual dinner, scheduled for October 20th, is now over 95% sold out. So please be in touch if you wish to join us this year. We're reducing capacity, moving to a larger space, and making some other changes to make sure we're as safe as possible for our guests this year. As you know, if you've watched WITA events in the past, we like to call out the names of some of those you are in community with, even if you can't see them in Zoom. So welcome today to Gustavo Prieto at the Ghent University in Belgium, Sherry Anderson with the Government of Alberta, Professor Edna Ramirez at the Universidad de Guadalajara, and Ambassador Sri G.S. Iyer at the Ministry of External Affairs in India. Welcome, Gustavo, Sherry, Edna, and Sri, and welcome to all of you wherever you are joining us from across the United States and in 25 different countries. With two of our discussants today coming to us from different cities in Switzerland, another in Crete, another in Ireland, plus discussants in the United States. So we have a very global panel and a global discussion today. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panelists using the Q&A tab on Zoom. We have a packed program, but hope to get to audience questions towards the end of our second panel. You should have also received a copy of our event program by email today, so we can dispense with lengthy introductions of today's discussants. Unfortunately, Maureen Hinman, who is supposed to moderate today's session, is under the weather. She was very much looking forward to moderating today's discussion, but sadly can't be with us today. We're pleased, however, to be joined by her colleague, my good friend Sarah Stewart of Silverado Policy Accelerator, who's been actively involved in all aspects of planning today's event. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Ken, and good morning to all of our esteemed panelists and this wide-ranging audience. Certainly won't be able to fill Maureen's shoes, but I'll try. We have a great event today. While the concept of circularity has historical origins, the modern take on a circular economy is influencing policy and impacting business and individual decisions the world over, as evidenced by the amount of folks we've got on in the audience today from around the world. When we're talking about the circular economy, we're talking about an economy that's seeking to minimize waste and pollution and keep materials and products in use so that they may be recycled and used again, a sort of reverse supply chain. Think of your computer. At the end of its life, it can be deconstructed into components that are recycled into scrap materials like copper or plastic, and then transformed into recycled commodities or inputs that are then used to manufacture a new computer. To achieve a circular economy, we must rely on the creation of economic and governance systems that can competitively regenerate diffuse and complex end-of-life products. In plain terms, we must create and sustain supply chains that work in reverse and whose recycled products compete on par with primary commodities. Today's panelists are going to discuss a range of technical, social, and governance challenges to establishing reverse supply chains. And we're going to ask them some of the tough questions. For example, what are the key technical and competitiveness challenges to establishing reverse supply chains and producing circular economy products? What is the impact of the waste paradigm on creating competitive reverse supply chains? How do we move these products and intermediaries out of the waste paradigm and into a circular paradigm? And finally, What is the role of trade governance and specifically trade facilitation in solving the technical, economic, and social barriers to creating reverse supply chains? Our first panel includes the boots on the ground, the people who are working on this to build the circular economy supply chains across a range of sectors, whether it's the scrap recycling industry, digital and technology products, textiles, or plant-based products. Our second panel is going to grapple with the policy and the politics of the circular economy and how this fits into the existing international institutions landscape, from Basel to the WTO to the World Customs Organization. So without further ado, let's turn to Adina Adler, and she's going to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and good day to everybody. I'm coming to you from Killarney in Ireland, the Irish Miss American tourist. So get your air tickets and come on over. I just want to start with a quick kind of level setting. We believe circular economy really does depend on recycling. Like, recycling really is a key component of the true circularity and the completion of the circular economy, and making that as a support to sustainability a reality. So let's just start with understanding what recycling is and how big recycling really is, especially in the United States, but I think the numbers are very similar around the world. We all think about recycling at home, the decision that we make to put our used water bottles, newspapers, jars into the recycle bin instead of the waste bin. But residential recycling is really only 20% of all recycling in the United States. It's a really small component, and it's already big enough. So the remainder, that 80%, is commercial recycling, industrial recycling. Commercial, you think about all of the cardboard boxes that are broken down at our local grocery stores. Industrial, you think about all that steel and aluminum that are being made around the country. 60 to 70% of steel made in the United States comes from scrap. 50 to 60% of aluminum made in the United States also comes from scrap. So it's significant. And it's for that reason where the recycling industry really is sort of like a first critical step in the supply chain. We help our manufacturers meet USMCA rules of origin requirements, particularly in the auto sector. The Buy American policies that the president has announced and reinforced yesterday. A lot of that can be fulfilled by knowing that feedstocks come through the recycling chain. So recycling is large, and in particular, we process approximately 130 million metric tons of recyclable commodities every year. That's metals, paper, plastic, tire and rubber, electronics, glass and textiles, all taken together. And that amount saves 400 million tons of carbon dioxide. That's enough energy to power 48 million homes for a whole year. So it's a lot of saved carbon, just by processing all of those recyclable materials. So it's really, really important. And those commodities are not waste. These are commodities. They are products. They are critical feedstocks for manufacturing. And it is that for that reason where trade is so important to ensuring a true circularity, that the sustainability of our world, fighting climate change. It helps to allow products and materials that come through the recycling chain to get into our global supply chains. So many of the companies represented here today, both as panelists, but also in the audience, your supply chains are global. You are not just confined to one home country. You require inputs from so many different parts of the world. And those inputs also include the materials and the products that come through the recycling system. And sometimes it is consumed in the home country, and sometimes it is required to be consumed by the manufacturer in another country. And because Americans in particular are really good about making those recycling decisions, we have a lot of feedstock available for manufacturers worldwide. And so we're trading those commodities into these global supply chains because of the demand by manufacturers. So let me repeat that. Recycling is a demand pull industry We are not hoarding commodities and waiting for commodity prices to change. You know, we're not building up supplies for the sake of building supplies. It's because there's a manufacturer, whether in the United States or elsewhere in the world, that needs these commodities, and we process them to a specification grade, to their specification, and we ship it to them. There is no good economics for putting end-of-life materials or products on a ship and sending it to another country to be dumped in a landfill. It actually makes absolutely no economic sense. Now, what we do as an association, the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industry, we represent all the companies that do all of that recycling that I have been talking about. And we have been promoting for decades responsible recycling. Responsible recycling is about respecting local laws and environmental policies. It's about processing materials to a specification grade. It's about the health and safety of employees. That's really, really critically important. And to the extent that that industries worldwide are following these rules and following these principles, you can have a safe and reliable supply chain of recyclable commodities. It's when you have those bad actors that are violating the rules, you know, that we see some of the situations that's happening out in the world today. We just hate that, and we are violently against that. Let me tell you, we just promote responsible recycling in every possible way. You know, so for us, all of this is to say is that you know, efforts to stifle trade is actually going to go against everything that this group believes in the circular economy, sustainability, and fighting against climate change. It really doesn't help. And so, you know, that's what we're here today as a discussion is, you know, we see these efforts at the Basel Convention, in the waste shipment regulations that are under review in the European Union, in countries that are loosely defining the word hazardous in order to implement restrictive measures on trade of recyclable commodities. All they are doing is promoting the use of carbon-intensive primary materials rather than products and materials that are already in the world and have exactly the same characteristics and use as those primary cousins. So, you know, all of this is to say, I just wanted to make sure that everybody understood that recycling is big, it's important, it's traded because of the demand by manufacturers globally, and it really saves a whole lot of energy, greenhouse gas emissions, mining for more ore. You know, it really is the original green industry and is so super important to sustainability. So I look forward to this discussion and to fielding questions later on. So I'll pass it off back to Sarah.
Adina, thank you so much. Your contributions are really invaluable, and I think we're going to get to a lot of these issues with the rest of the panelists. So thank you. Jessica, we'll turn it over to you.
Can you see my slides? Yes, okay, great. First, I just want to say thanks to WITA and Ken and Diego and whole WITA staff for organizing this event and the opportunity to be involved. We're really excited, in particular as the Plant-Based Products Council, to be sponsoring this event because circular economy is really at the core of our industry. So I'll be talking a little bit about the role that plant-based products play in a circular economy and some of the challenges that this industry and these products face. Right, so first, just to introduce PBPC, we were launched about 2.5 years ago, and we represent a broad cross-section of companies, large and small, that support shifting to a more circular economy through greater adoption of products and materials that are made from renewable plant-based inputs and are supported by appropriate end-of-life infrastructure. I've listed a few of our members here, representing really a range of links in the plant-based products value chain, feedstock providers, plastic resin manufacturers, packaging converters, even consumer-facing companies. So to give a quick overview of plant-based products, so many of the products and materials that we use every day can be made from renewable inputs, from cleaning products to personal care products, even durable goods like car parts and building materials, along with things like plastics and food serviceware. I also just wanted to highlight the real significant diversity in feedstocks that can be used from what we call commodity crops like corn or soybeans, to things like grasses, ag waste materials, rice husk, and hemp, just as some examples. And there's a number of benefits that these materials provide. One, of course, improves circularity, and I have a graphic that I'll walk through to kind of demonstrate that. Another is reducing our reliance on fossil fuels by using more renewable inputs to make products and materials. Another is functionality, and I think we commonly see misconceptions that plant-based products don't work as well, but in fact, a number of plant-based chemicals and materials can be made identical to their traditional counterparts. And then there's completely novel, plant-based materials that provide improved or even unique functionality. And then there's versatile end-of-life options. I do want to be very clear that plant, or sometimes called bio-based products, are not all biodegradable. That's a misconception we commonly hear. Some of these products are recyclable. They can be made just chemically identical to a commonly recycled product. Some of them are also compostable. It's also really important to understand that biodegradable does not necessarily mean compostable. And then finally, plant-based materials can help grow the US bioeconomy. We're kind of US focused here, but so using renewable feedstocks, often commodity crops that are grown here in the US, processed nearby where they're grown, that leads to economic development and quality green jobs in rural America. This is the graphic I referred to, really helping to demonstrate the circularity of plant-based products and materials. So in a circular economy, we're trying to eliminate waste and extend the useful life of products and materials, as Sarah mentioned. So showing how plant-based products and materials fit into the circular economy. So we start with a renewable input, a plant-based feedstock like hemp or corn or sugar beets. And then with the help of scientists and engineers, those feedstocks are converted into renewable chemicals and materials like a bioplastic resin, for example. And those chemicals and materials are in turn used to make a product like a packaging or a textile or absorbent. And then depending on the product, some of these are recyclable and many are compostable, and that can help lead to the creation of compost that can help support healthy soils that are needed to grow the next cycle of feedstocks. So while there's a lot of reasons to think that these products can play a significant role in a more circular future, they also face a lot of challenges. So I'm going to touch on these at kind of a high level here, but then look forward to talking about them in more detail during the Q&A. So for one, there's just a lack of general awareness about plant-based materials. And where there is awareness, sometimes there's confusion. The general public and even companies may not know they exist. They may not know all the options available. They don't know how they perform, or they have misconceptions about the impacts that the products could have on external factors like land use or food supply. And with a lot of attention on plastics right now, plant or bio-based plastics can be impacted by broad-based regulations or bans on plastics or packaging that don't distinguish the potential role that plant-based products can play in improving the circularity of plastics, for example, especially compostable plastics that can play kind of a unique role. There's also a lot of misunderstanding about these products that around this assumption that plant-based products are always going to be 100% bio-based or plant-based, and then policy requirements are being established based on that assumption. Now, while that might be possible for some products, or maybe the base chemicals to be 100% plant-based or bio-based or near that, it's not always technically feasible for finished goods. So there's a constant, innovation happening to increase those percentages, but recognizing that's, a common misconception. Lack of infrastructure from an end-of-life standpoint is certainly an issue. Adina has talked a bit about recycling, and there's, challenges that system can face, but compostable products, another sort of piece of this industry that I mentioned, can face similar challenges. really in the fact that there's not robust access to composting facilities, or that those facilities may only take yard waste. So I think from a PBPC standpoint, that's one of our priorities to address that. And the last one I'll just touch on quickly is just as a kind of newer and growing industry, there's a lot of challenges in the lack of metrics or tools to really measure the industry. At least here in North America and in the US, the MAKE system doesn't have separate codes for plant or bio-based products. It makes it really difficult to know the economic impact of the industry and to really help inform policy decisions. It's also really difficult to measure how our bioeconomy in the US is doing versus how other parts of the world are doing. And if you're interested, I think the USDA is putting out a new report in about 35 minutes about the bio-based products industry and economic impact. So look out for that if you're interested. So I hope that gives you kind of a good overview of the role that plant-based products can play in the circular economy and some of the challenges that these products face. And I will look forward to discussing more later in that.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was fascinating. Now we're going to turn to Susannah with Apple.
Good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here, and I'm excited to talk about similar things that you've just heard from Jessica and Adina. I've been at Apple for 7 years, working on embedding environmental initiatives into our manufacturing, and this idea of circularity is so intrinsic to that concept. So at Apple, we have very ambitious environmental goals emphasized, but I want to talk about the operational realities of what it's needed to navigate and accomplish, particularly our goal around circularity. It's so interesting for me to hear from Jessica and Adina the common challenges that we face across our different industries. And for example, we are making a lot of progress on the technical side and the economic side. Examples of this include using our material recovery lab, which is located in Austin, Texas, to develop new end-of-life solutions for material recovery, and innovating new materials like our 100% recycled aluminum alloy, which is now shipping on a lot of products. And then from the economic perspective, we've also demonstrated progress sending demand signals and using our buying power to expedite the development and adoption of secondary materials. And while much slower, certainly, than we would like, we do show progress on both of these fronts. And instead, it's actually our experience working within waste policy. Jessica just mentioned the broad bans on cross-border regulations. This challenge here that's a major limiting factor accelerating our adoption of circularity over the last 5 years. And I want to spend some time today talking about this. As Sarah said, this is the boots on the ground discussion, and so I intend to go exactly there. So let's see if I can, whoops, pardon me, move my slides forward. Do not, pardon me for 1 second, everyone. Appear to have a stuck keynote. I'm going to reload keynote for 1 second. Here we are. As you may know, Apple's vision is to one day make our products using only 100% recycled and renewable material. And so to fully understand how ambitious that is, it's important to understand what our supply chain looks like. Boy, Keynote's really given me a challenge on Zoom today. So let's first start by talking about our forward supply chain. After all, you just saw in that poorly animated stuck closed loop image, circular economy is simply the inverse of that forward supply chain. So this is data that we publish online about our supply chain. We have over 1,000 suppliers that are audited in over 45 economies. And this doesn't even begin to cover the entire supply chain by any means. But it does show you how large our footprint is and with how many suppliers we are constantly engaging. And again, coming back to this boots on the ground concept, this is really important for us to understand what it takes to scale circularity. So what I'm showing you here are all the subcomponents that are needed to make a single product at Apple. And I'm sure you're familiar with some of these, and as some of you might have a watch band here or have seen the housing of a phone before. And we're able to launch new products that are highly desirable by customers, like iPhones and watches, because of the advantages afforded by a global supply chain. And those are things like competition, social specialization, economies of scale. allocation and flexibility across diverse supply. This is certainly nothing unique to Apple. This is the power and the benefit of a globalized economy. But let me take an example of this aluminum housing that you should be able to see here in the top right and map that housing against Apple's supply chain and against our goals of circularity. So here is, if we were to follow that gray housing that you saw on the top right and map it onto the actual iPhone supply chain, this is the image that you see. The box that I've highlighted in red captures that housing being made just by 3 suppliers that feed into our entire supply chain of one model of iPhone. So imagine the scale of the challenge we're faced with if we want to ensure that all the materials feeding into that individual node comes from recycled or renewable sources, and that any losses in the process are recovered and put back into our product. So if you took that incredible web and now we zoomed out, I'm showing you here the 50,000 foot view, for example, of a circular supply chain. And these green lines indicate specific opportunities for materials to be recovered and re-enter our upstream. Again, you can think about those nodes that I just showed you. So for illustration purposes, you can think of these origin points or the green arrows as apples. Let's say it's our post-industrial scrap or our post-consumer scrap, but it could be truly any brand who's looking to integrate circularity into their business model. No matter the producer, where materials are destined for recycling, today they are deemed as waste. And this is, of course, intended to prevent illegal and undesirable dumping. And as Adina said, this is a wonderfully robust system, and that bad actors can sometimes take this and undermine responsible recycling. The permit process, though, which was intended to control the flow of materials, is extremely ambiguous and time consuming. And last year, for example, we spent 5 months, you can see this in the top right, getting approval to move one specific type of post-industrial material to a targeted specialty recycler, only for that permit to expire in just 10 months. So this extensive process becomes a major hindrance in our agility needed to convert that very complex supply chain I just showed you a few slides ago into one that prioritizes secondary materials, because we simply can't compete with the ease of sourcing primary materials. So at Apple, we're thinking a lot about opportunities to protect and safeguard the regulations like the Basel Convention have set to accomplish, while creating more free material movement for those pursuing circularity. And this is something that we refer to as the concept of a resource recovery lane. Here we believe that economies should have the agency to opt in to expedite the efficient movement of regulated materials for circular supply chains, but that they should do so in a manner that enables traceable and responsible movement of recovered materials to pre-approved facilities with sound social and environmental practices. And this is very much aligned with the objectives of the Basel Convention and maintains strong protection against the illegal movement of waste while streamlining shipments to responsible recyclers to allow for the circular supply chains to compete with extractive ones. Something like this pre-approved resource recovery lane is just one idea, but essentially essential to this, we need a system that surpasses the environmental protections we have today. So to summarize very quickly, I'll just put it into 3 parts that we believe here at Apple are needed. The first is that industry leaders and policymakers alike need to embrace this opportunity to support and accelerate responsible and commercial development of recovered materials. The second, and you just heard this from Jessica as well around data, is that we need to have safe, responsible, and scalable systems that identify and verify recoverable waste and safe pathways of those materials to appropriate facilities. And then lastly, and I'm sure you'll hear about this more with other panelists this morning, depending on where you are, is that we need a policy landscape that can help encourage, audit, and enforce the responsible and efficient movement of recoverable material. We believe that collaboration in these areas could drastically change the economics of responsible recycling and create more productive and safe avenues for circularity. So at Apple, we're very optimistic about the future. It is not without its challenges, but through examples like this and through panels like this and discussions with folks like you, we really hope to demonstrate what's possible and bring forward the circular supply chain. Thank you.
Thanks, Susannah. Really appreciate your comments. We're going to move to Julian now. We're a couple of minutes behind, so I'm not going to ask you to talk fast, Julian, but just bear in mind that we need to get to the second panel as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. I'll try and be as succinct as I can be. Let me just pull up my screen. So good afternoon, good morning to everybody on the call. It's a pleasure to be with you and to share some of the work that we're doing on circular economy at VF. I'm a Senior Sustainability Manager based in our EMEA office here in Switzerland. I'm responsible for the outdoor and action sports brands in VF, including the North Face and our merino wool brands, Smart Wool and Icebreaker. I'm going to use the time I have today to talk to you briefly about our strategy and then show you where circular economy fits within our strategy, why it's there, and a little bit about how we're bringing it to life through our brands. So for those who don't know VF is made up of a dozen different brands spread across lifestyle, outdoor, and action sports. Our purpose as a corporation is to power movements of sustainable and active lifestyles for the betterment of people and our planet. And the purpose of each of those brands ladders back to this corporate purpose. The purpose forms the foundation for our sustainability strategy, which we call Made for Change. Made for Change is comprised of 3 pillars. I'm going to speak to the first 2 because I think they're the most relevant for this conversation. The first is circular business models. Our aspiration here is to transform the apparel and footwear industry from being linear to circular. And our 2020-30 goal is to lead the commercialization of circular business models through brand-led re-commerce and rental initiatives. Re-commerce and rental will be fundamentally important tools in driving circular business models. But more broadly, when we talk about circularity, designing for circularity will be absolutely fundamental as well. Then our second goal is scale for good. So how do we transform our industry's 3 biggest impacts: climate change, materials, and worker well-being? Our 2030 goal here is to halve our environmental impact from farm to front door by 2030. There's fundamentally important levers we will have to pull to do that. The most relevant being for this conversation is to drastically reduce the impact of our key materials. Our Made for Change pillars are our supporting network to drive our North Star, which is our science-based targets, which we set back in 2019. VF was one of the first organizations in the textile industry to set science-based targets, and they are what we are now working towards, as we feel that is the right target for us to set to really create the sustainable change we need to see in the industry. So we have 2 key targets for our science-based goals. The first is to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 55% by 2030, and then our scope 3 emissions by 30%. Now, if you notice in the second column, you look at our CO2 emissions, we are disproportionately leveraged into our scope 3 emissions compared to our scope 1 and 2. To show that, if you look on the right of this slide, you'll see that scope 1 and 2 only makes up 1% of our overall VF emissions, with scope 3 making up the other 99%. So we really have to put the majority of our focus there. And scope 3, both upstream and downstream activities, there are a lot of ways we can intervene in that to impact and reduce our scope 3 emissions. How do we source our raw materials? How do we process raw materials? What are the ways we do manufacturing? How do we enable our consumers to consume more sustainably? How do we manage products at end of life? These are all fundamentally important questions, and they're absolutely critical to circularity. And I want to show you just kind of some of the ways that we feel we can intervene to drive that circular revolution we need to reduce our scope 3 emissions. Most fundamentally, we need to look at our materials we put into the process. Here, we need to use sustainable materials, and the 3 R's, so recycled, responsibly sourced, renewable, or regenerative materials. These will be fundamentally important, and they will feed into the products that we make. The products that we make, the environmental impact of those products is hugely influenced by the way that we design them. About 80% of the environmental impact of a product is decided at the design phase. And we're doing a lot of work to educate our designers to design our products to be circular. By doing that, we fundamentally change the way that the rest of the life cycle of that product, how the rest of the life cycle of the product will be managed. By designing for circularity and ensuring that goods that our products are designed for end of life, we can help reduce industrial waste and resource consumption. We can make sure that those goods are kept in usable condition for longer. And to extend the product life cycle by doing that, we also need to put other infrastructure in place. We do a lot of work around this, particularly around repair and reuse, as well as incentivizing take-back schemes so that goods, when they do come to the end of their usable lives, they can be brought back to us and then either made into a new product or repaired and re-commercialized. So when we look at our science-based targets, there's two key ways in terms of circularity that we need to intervene to goals that we have. The first is around sustainable materials. So by 2030, 100% of our top 9 materials will originate from regenerative, responsibly sourced renewable, or recycled sources. And then circularity, we know we need to lead the large-scale commercialization of circular business models by 2030 if we're going to reach our goals. So just to finish, I wanted to touch on a couple of the initiatives that our brands are leading as we go on this journey. We're still at an early stage. The North Face has been a champion of re-commerce. Back in 2018-19, we launched the North Face Renewed, which is a dedicated part of our business now, where we take damaged and defective North Face products, repair it, refurbish it, and then re-commercialize it at a different price point. So really giving us a space in that re-commerce market, but also making sure that TNF product is used for its full lifetime and doesn't end up going into waste earlier than that. Leading on the lead that North Face set, Timberland has now just recently launched its own re-commerce platform in partnership with Recircled in North America to drive forward with re-commercializing re-commercialize Timberland footwear. And then on the design side, one of our smaller brands, Napa Piri, has been a pioneer on circular design with its Infinity collection, which is a nylon-based jacket range where the whole jacket has been designed in such a way that when it reaches end of life, the jacket can be returned back to Napa Piri and then turned directly back into the source material for another Infinity jacket. So really, truly closing the loop. And then finally, the North Face has been involved very heavily for a number of years in regenerative agriculture, both for wool and for cotton. Here we are working directly with farmers and traders to change the way that some of our natural fibers we use in our products are farmed. So rather than those farming methods actually having a negative impact on the farms where they are grown, actually working with the farmers to change the way that they're farming so that we can stop soil erosion, increase the carbon sequestration potential of the land. And that actually holds out the exciting possibility of actually making our materials carbon positive. So these are just some of the interventions that we are taking as we move on this circular journey. We're still in the early stages. We have many, many challenges, and I think some of the other panelists spoke really, really well to some of the challenges that we face as an industry, both in terms of the infrastructure there to support things like end-of-life recycling. We're still very early on in the evolution of that. And having the right policies coming in, and it's something which is very, very important in the EU right now, making sure we have the right policies coming in to support the development and growth of the circular economy. So I know I'm a little bit tight on time, so Sarah, I'll pass back to you at this point.
Thank you. And I think the end of your remarks was the perfect segue to our second panel. So thank you very much to panel 1. We will ask you to turn off your cameras and bring on panel 2, and we will bring panel 1 back in just a little bit. Here we go. Fantastic. Well, we've heard a lot of success stories, but also a lot of challenges. So we're going to start with you, Ho Lim. I think your perspective from the WTO is going to be invaluable here. Turn it over to you.
Right, thank you very much to the invitation. I just have a few slides that I'd like to share. And I just wanted to give a bit of a perspective from a trade policy dimension to what we've heard so far. Let me try to sort this out. Do you see the slides? Okay, I presume you do. So let me first.
We don't see them yet. Sorry, Ho Lim. They're
Okay.
not showing up.
Are they showing up?
I'll give you a thumbs up.
Does this help?
Not yet.
Oh, it's a shame if it won't show.
Okay, we've got something here. Great.
Is it working?
Yes, that's working.
All right. Sorry about that delay. I think we tried to go to basics, which was try to understand what type of trade measures were being notified to the WTO that could be said to be within this domain of trade and circular economy. So we looked at our environmental database. The environmental database captures everything notified to WTO under all the WTO agreements. And we created a category of different types of measures that could be said to be within circular economy. So this was in terms of reuse and repair, refurbishment, remanufacturing, recycling, eco-design, and waste to energy. Here you see the few of the categories that we tried to map out. And we tried to understand what were governments doing, what were they taking as measures. And perhaps not surprisingly, we find that the bulk of the measures come into this area of recycling. And we then try to break it down a little bit more in terms of what type of measures are we looking at. So the color bars basically show technical regulations, which is in sort of darker blue. You've got support measures, which are the orange, bans and licenses, which are the green, procurement, and then we had an other category. I won't spend too much time, but just we have a staff working paper on this for those who are interested, and I can provide you with a link later. But essentially, I think the interesting things that we found was that, there's a lot of measures being taken in this area of support or subsidies related, but also quite a lot on bans and licenses. And I think some of these things were already mentioned by some of the previous speakers. Now, this is a very basic mapping. It doesn't tell you much about the content of the measures and about whether they are supportive or not supportive of the circular economy. And I think the other thing to just draw out is that what we're seeing currently is that a lot of this is in the area of technical regulations and standards. Okay. In terms of distribution, measures are being taken by governments worldwide. A large share of it currently Asia, North America, Europe, and it's just interesting to see that it's a global sort of situation where we find more and more measures that could be said to be within the area of circular economy. But again, this is just a very broad sort of indication. And I think the more interesting questions to ask is basically what type of measures would support the circular economy and in which areas could trade policy actually make a difference. And I think some of these things we heard already from your speakers, and this will be the main point I'll be making in this short presentation, is that there's a lot to be done on definitions and classifications. As many of the speakers said, I think that's really the starting point, to try to distinguish between waste, streams and reusable materials or feedstocks, if you like. And currently what we see is that a lot of reusable materials end up becoming directed into a waste stream. Now, if they are at the start classified as waste, you then hit a whole range of measures that would makes things much more difficult, particularly when it comes to cross-border movement, because instruments currently are a little bit blunt. So if it ends up in waste, it goes to a completely different direction, and you deal with bans, for instance, or you deal with certain requirements under the Basel Convention. If they're not classified as waste and they are classified as a secondary material, you then have a different set of measures. But currently, I don't think things are sensitive enough to actually make that distinction or make a good distinction there. So that's one area of work. The other is actually the standards themselves. There are new standards and regulations emerging for the circular economy, ensuring that these standards promote an efficient global circular economy seems to be quite challenging because there's multiplicity of standards. Some of them diverge, some of them have different requirements, and making sure that different requirements or procedures are complied with globally can be very expensive, and they can also obstruct reverse supply chains. So there's an agenda here for more convergence, let's say, and in the best case scenario, working towards international standards to try to reduce unnecessary divergences, build trust and confidence. What are some of the tools for this? It's really, I think, in the area of regulatory cooperation, which is quite a wide spectrum. At the highest level, it's full harmonization. At the lower level, it's about exchange of information and developing better understanding. Maybe one could aim for somewhere in the middle as sort of a way to try to facilitate a circular economy. And then the next 2 points, which is the sort of 3 and 4 points about facilitating reverse supply chains. One key area, I think, that where trade policy could make a significant difference is facilitating trade in goods, goods that are needed for reverse supply chains and circular economy goods themselves. So here, I think we need to learn more, and certainly from the companies and the industries working in this, to understand what type of goods are we talking about and what type of barriers are they facing, be it in tariffs, and should these tariffs be going down, or on what types of products and inputs. And if it's more than tariffs, maybe it's more about, as I was saying earlier, more about regulatory requirements of some sort. Could there be a better way forward to reduce regulatory divergences, for instance? But I think for many trade people, it's, if I can say, it's about understanding the goods themselves. What goods are we talking about, and how are they actually classified under the harmonized system? Maybe they're not classified, and if they're not classified, what type of new classifications are required? Very much linked to goods, I think, is services, and perhaps even I don't want to say more important, because both are important, but clearly we hear more and more that services restrictions do have an impact, and a probably significant impact, on the circular economy. Many parts of the circular economy value chain, such as repair, recovery, redistribution, end-of-life recycling, and so forth, are themselves services. So there seems to be an agenda here to facilitate trade in services. One can also go to what was mentioned earlier by another speaker, product design. Research and development for product design, for instance, is also a service. So is testing, so is installation, assembly, and so forth. So one can think about what type of trade and services package is needed to support the circular economy. And actual circular economy products themselves can be a form of service. We hear increasingly digital solutions technological innovations are creating sharing platforms, product service systems. So again, it's a new way of thinking about trade and services. And the very last point, and I think this is quite critical to the reverse supply chain and allowing secondary materials to flow, is that many developing countries sometimes lack the capacity. Sometimes it's regulatory capacity, sometimes it's enforcement capacity to deal with flows currently. And so a capacity building agenda to help them as well to make this transition to the circular economy. It could be about strengthening good regulatory practices, combating environmental crime. Some of these things are not strictly trade, but they have an impact on trade, enhancing a country's quality infrastructure, essentially a trade facilitation package that helps developing countries find ways to do this transition to a circular economy and have more sensitive instruments that deal with problems. And then there are serious problems with waste and waste streams, but at the same time benefit from the new growing circular economy. And so those were my 5 suggestions for the panel to think about, and also for the participants. And lastly, at the WTO front, these issues are emerging both in the Committee on Trade and Environment. We've got 2 new initiatives. One is structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability, and another one is informal dialogue on plastics. So many opportunities here to think about how to take these things forward. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Ho-Lim. That was very informative, and I'm looking forward to hearing reactions to some of your proposals. Let's turn now to Dr. Charlotte Seibergasser.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. Perhaps Ho-Lim can stop sharing the slides. Well, I'm joining you today from Greece, but I'm originally Swiss, as you will find out in a minute. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here today, and perhaps to add one additional quite new measure that states could be taking in order to foster circular economy and more sustainable trade in the future, that has just been recently explored in Switzerland. Now, as we've heard, to some extent, circular economy today tends to rely heavily on consumer preferences and on private sector initiatives. We've heard a couple of examples, and as Ho-Lim just explained, actually state action or action from the public sector is usually limited to technical regulations and standards, which tend to apply on the national territory of the country more or less alone. Now, this is due to the fact that products which are part of circular economy value chains and products which are not are generally, they need to be treated like products under the WTO. So states cannot treat the circular economy products or services more preferably than the other products. And this has been criticized for a while for being a stumbling block also in the fostering of circular economy by the state. And just recently, actually, the EFTA states, that's Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, concluded the first preferential trade agreement with Indonesia that includes a preferential treatment which is limited to sustainably produced palm oil in this case. This is very new. It has been argued for a while that what's not possible under the WTO agreements could actually be possible to agree to in preferential trade agreements, but it has never been done so far. So this is the first time we actually do have such a trade agreement that attempts at fostering more sustainable production through preferential tariff treatment. So let me just run you quickly through the mechanism in that agreement so you understand more or less what I'm talking about here. So in the sustainable trade, in the sustainability chapter of that comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Indonesia, there is a commitment that only sustainably produced palm oil is going to be traded among the partners. And why did they agree to that? Well, Indonesia is the main exporter to the global market of palm oil. So there was clearly an interest in getting additional market access for exports of palm oil. On the other hand, in the EFTA states, there was some concern over an increase of exports of palm oil coming from Indonesia, because in the past, it has been the case that sometimes palm oil production actually led to deforestation of primary forests in Indonesia. And consumers were quite concerned about this side effect of their consumption. So the partners actually agreed to limit preferential treatment to certified palm oil. In the case of Switzerland, that works in a way that those preferences, tariff preferences, are only granted once an importer can demonstrate that the palm oil is RSPO certified or similar certified, carries a similar label that ensures that no primary forest has been affected by the production, and the indigenous people are not affected, and labor is treated fairly, etc. A closer look on this actual mechanism then reveals that, in fact, Indonesia has been exporting not very much palm oil to Switzerland, but over 90% of the palm oil from Indonesia is actually for the purpose of animal feed. And animal feed imports of palm oil are tariff-free generally on a most favored nation basis in Switzerland. So 90% of the imports of palm oil from Indonesia are actually not part of that mechanism, because Switzerland was not able to grant any preference. On the other hand, the rest of the imports of palm oil from Indonesia have already been RSPO certified prior to the negotiation of that trade agreement, because they're intended for the food industry, and consumer preferences are so heavily aligned in Switzerland that consumers care about RSPO certification or cared already prior to the negotiations. So ultimately, Indonesia actually was gained security for market access, gained some more preferential treatment for some purposes of their exports of palm oil, but did not essentially lose any of the market access that it had prior to the negotiations of that trade agreement. Now, I would actually qualify that kind of mechanism more as a nudge, because of what I just explained, that the tariff preferences are actually limited. The incentive, the economic incentive, is rather limited with regard to just economic gains from this preferential treatment. So it's more of a nudge for Indonesian palm oil producers and for Swiss importers of palm oil from Indonesia to actually care about RSPO certification and sustainable production. And I think that's actually one of the advantages of that mechanism, that it has entered the discussion. People are very aware of the fact that the consumption of palm oil has an impact, or might have an impact, on primary forests around the world, and they started to really care about products which have this sustainability label. Now, what we can learn for this very specific discussion now with regard to circular economy is that there is actually a possibility for states to proactively nudge trade flows to a more sustainable or circular economy character or nature through preferential trade agreements that use this kind of incentives or nudges, as did the EFTA Indonesia agreement. And I've come up with basically 4 conditions that need to be met in order to use the same mechanism also for other issues unrelated to palm oil, for example, for recycling or waste concerns, etc. So first of all, we need a very clear, identifiable issue that can be described in an easy, understandable way. We need to have a label that is already established and actually promises to deliver the results that it actually stands for. And we need to have consumer preferences. They need to be aligned with this kind of concern, because otherwise there is a risk that this kind of preferential mechanism is essentially a hidden protectionist measure, or the other partner would not be willing to agree to such a preference. And finally, of course, in order to be meaningful also economically, it can only be applied to products or services which still have some kind of tariffs. If it's tariff-free, like in the case of palm oil for animal feed, there is not really any preference that could be granted in return to the sustainability label. So I would just like to enter this into the discussion, because I think we've heard a lot of these concerns in the previous contributions. And if we would work towards such consumer preferences, and if we would have access to suitable labels, that could be something that could be considered in the future to also include circular economy concerns. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That is a novel development. So appreciate you bringing that to everyone's attention. Some good food for thought. Okay, Paul, you're going to round us out on the panel too.
Good morning, good afternoon, folks. Let's call up the screen here for a moment. And thanks, Sarah and Ken and the folks at WITA for the invitation to join the discussion. I think it's a timely conversation to have. And following on some of the level setting that Adina and Susannah and others have put out there, and some of the very good ideas that Ho Lim shared. I liked his 5-point punch list for solving problems. I think those are all helpful pathways. I think my part of the conversation is to briefly demystify the Basel Convention. This is the legal framework that is in place. It is mature, it is robust, and as Holden observed, it's a blunt legal instrument. That's actually a term I use regularly to describe it, but the convention's been around for 30 years. 188 countries follow these rules. It basically informs national legislation worldwide for how wastes are classified and managed. And although we won't talk about it today, keep in mind that there is a OECD agreement that governs trade in recyclables among OECD countries, and a series of bilaterals that sit alongside Basel as part of the overall legal framework. But if you wanted Basel at a glance, here it is. It's a framework that essentially defines the universe of wastes that are covered. Basically, anything going for recycling or final disposal falls into the waste bin. It then sets up a series of hazardous waste and other waste classifications. There isn't a big distinction in terms of how those wastes are managed, other than one particular trade ban. But it's important to know that it's sort of a one-size-fits-all universe. And it is a very cumbersome prior notice and informed consent system, government-to-government approvals that requires environmentally sound management, movement documents, financial assurance. It is purposefully designed to make it difficult to move things across borders for recycling, because the convention was originally designed to avoid the unregulated dumping of wastes in the wrong places. And I think most people would agree that the convention has largely been successful at keeping waste from going to the wrong places. And now the question is, can it be modernized and right-sized for the broader sustainability challenges that people have been talking about? But I also think it's important to keep in mind that like most MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements, this is not a static legal framework. It is very dynamic. And I've punched up a few things that are active here that will really inform the ambitions around the circular economy for some time. But first, as some of you know, plastics were recently brought into the purview of the Basel Convention. For a long time, plastics were outside the convention. And just recently in January, most global plastics trade for recycling has been brought into that universe of controls and trade bans. We have active negotiations underway. They're kind of suspended this week. The COP is meeting this week virtually due to COVID, but they will reconvene next spring in June. And among the discussions are proposals that would take some universe of used products managed for repair and reuse and perhaps bring them within the purview of the convention. That's a difficult conversation and a very nuanced conversation. There's a very significant proposal from the Swiss and the government of Ghana to put all e-waste into the purview of the convention, not just hazardous e-waste. So that would dramatically expand the scope of end-of-life products and components that fall into the scheme. And then just a couple of years down the road, if you were to look at what's under negotiation, again, we have a work group engaged on this that will resume again in October. The governments for the first time are really tweaking the pillars of the convention for how hazardous waste is defined, again, at the international level, and then by extension worldwide in 188 countries. And so they're looking at things like, should cobalt or lithium components or constituents be a trigger for a presumptive hazardous waste classification? Again, that ripples through the control scheme for how things can or cannot move around. So when we think about circularity and sustainable resource use, some big questions here when you think about how that legal framework is evolving. You know, are some electronics going for recycling controlled, or are all electronics? We'll have generation of EV batteries in the future. You know, what are the flows? What will be legally permissible? Where will those facilities be? Can we get materials to the right places for resilient supply chains? Plastics already controlled. Many governments regard solar panels as a type of e-waste. So to the extent e-waste gets expanded, to what extent are we capturing all solar panels? Again, closing off certain flows, controlling in a one-size-fits-all other flows. So these are challenges that I think the policymakers have to sort out as they think about what needs to be controlled. But since we're talking the trade part of this, I'll just punch up some of the very obvious trade disruptions that we see companies trying to manage. But one, once a waste falls into the convention, whether it's on Annex 2, just non-hazardous waste like plastics, or something like kryptonite that's quite hazardous, you're subject to these robust prior informed consent government by government authorization processes that are by design very cumbersome. You also have the US being uniquely disadvantaged because we are a non-party, which means we sort of sit in the back of the room and have little influence, I think it's fair to say, over how this evolves, given that we've been a non-party for 30 years. The US is subject to a party non-party trade ban. So once something is brought into the purview of the convention, and as Adina observed, a lot of types of materials are, the US in the first instance is subject to a trade ban with all of those other 188 countries, unless we can find a side arrangement under Article 11 that will allow a particular flow to continue. There's also a ban on shipments of hazardous waste from OECD to non-OECD countries. Again, a very blunt approach to say all non-OECD countries are off limits for handling certain materials. And unfortunately, we've seen a little bit of a breakdown in how Basel is integrated or carried over into the OECD The governments were not able to reach consensus on how plastics recycling should be classified and managed within the OECD. So there's a fair amount of legal uncertainty right now that the governments are still sorting out with respect to those flows. So I'm not going to go into this, but I'll just highlight that when you think about 2 years ago, most plastics worldwide were not regulated. Now, most, if not the most important flows are regulated. There's a small bucket for hazardous plastics that's really always been there. It's just been clarified. There's a very narrow lane for certain polymers that are almost free from contamination if they're on a specific list, and everything else defaults to being covered by the convention. I highlight this to show how dramatic the trade implications can be. Norway proposed this, and inside of a year, we went from very little plastics trade being controlled to virtually all plastics trade being controlled. Recognizing that Ho-Lim had his list, here's my list to sit alongside his. But I think just from a company and operational standpoint, when you have leadership companies being ambitious on circularity, it's really important to think about where the convention is now and where it's going in terms of what's likely to be covered. I think the parties, just as we're discussing here on both the trade and an environmental side of the ledger, need to assess what needs to be controlled and what are the unintended consequences of bringing things into this current legal framework. But we can also think about ways of modernizing the PIC procedure. There are trade facilitation measures that could be integrated into Basel. There are trade facilitating measures that raise the bar on environmental performance and social safeguards that could be built outside of Basel as Article 11, and folks have touched on those. I think Adina is probably in the best position to think about what needs to be done with end of waste materials. When does something that's partially processed, ready to go back into manufacturing, can we draw some lines that really pull that out of the waste bin and into commerce? But for me, sitting in Washington, D.C., I think it's important to acknowledge that the U.S. is really not a full participant in the circular economy if we're sitting outside Basel. And I know some of the business and NGO stakeholders are starting to give Basel a look. It's never been terribly controversial. It's just been a question of how much energy folks want to put behind it. But I think that would be a big step in removing some of the unfortunate trade barriers that the U.S. faces in this space. So I'll kick it back to you, Sarah, and I hope that quick tour was helpful.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm going to invite panel 1 to rejoin on camera. So I think we've had a really interesting discussion so far. Panel 1 has set out what I think are a number of great success stories, but also a number of challenges, whether it's competing with virgin materials or challenges within existing international frameworks, an inability to deal with trade disruptions or to facilitate trade, lack of infrastructure for end of life or for reused materials, restrictions on bans in trade. And then we have panel 2, who's come in with, I think, a lot of really thoughtful solutions of how we get at some of these challenges through harmonization of definitions and tariff classifications, thinking about, what more work needs to be done on circular economy standards and technical regulations, new efforts at trade facilitation, modernizing existing frameworks. So I guess, the question that I would throw out to this, collective panel now to think about as you're answering some of the Q&A from the audience is, how do we bring all of this together? How do we think about how can we move fast, move forward, and in what framework? Do we need to bifurcate the frameworks that we have for waste materials versus primary commodity versus recyclable materials? How do we take that next step forward? So think about that in some of your remarks. I'm going to turn to Ken. He's going to give you some Q&A from the audience. And again, thank you all for your comments.
Thanks. I don't want to interrupt the discussion that's already might take place. So if folks want to maybe think about the question Sarah just posed, we do want to get to some audience questions. I want to start with, we've had a couple have been answered already in writing, and you may be able to see those. but I'm still want to tie some of those back to the panel in general. We have a few of the questions that come in that kind of tie both things together, but I want to start with maybe some things that panel one brought up. There's been a boom of e-commerce, a lot of packaging went around, and I think one of the questions that was asked by 2 or 3 of the people in there has to do with sort of the responsibility of both producers and consumers. And do producers have some responsibility, producers and retailers, of helping their consumers do their part in the circular economy? Certainly, those of us in the United States, and many or most jurisdictions, I think, have those blue bins that we can recycle. But I don't know if, there were some questions about the developing world as well. Are there abilities and do they have the capability to do their part in the recycling circle and keeping these products in the circular economy moving?
I'd be happy to start chiming
Thanks,
in on that,
Susannah.
Ken. I think that producers, manufacturers certainly have a big responsibility to play. And Julian mentioned a couple of the product innovations that they're working on that demonstrate what type of messaging can be conveyed to consumers through the materials themselves, through the products themselves. At Apple, a couple of examples of initiatives that I think that are very important that we participate in, and that a lot of peer companies do as well, is first enabling collection schemes and enabling collection programs. So trade-in programs, for example, zero value collection programs. You can bring any device in to an Apple retail store or return it online for free recycling or trade-in. Those types of things are incredibly important so that customers understand they can come back to the retailers and the producers to create an ease of device return. And then the second part of it is the actual products themselves and the signal that brands can portray to their customers through the types of the materials that are embedded within their products. So at Apple, we also have a commitment to remove all single-use plastics from our packaging by 2025. These are the types of messages that customers can understand, and it creates an ease of participation. There's a number of barriers that prohibit people from returning devices and from participating in recycling schemes. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to make some of these programs and choices more easy for customers and delightful, even beyond easy, to participate in, so there's fewer barriers to entry.
Just to jump in there, I totally echo what Susannah's saying. And to go back to an earlier point Sarah made at the start, some of the things we're talking about when we talk about the circular economy are not new. I think in our sector, we talk a lot about warranty. We've had warranty in the North Face for 50 years. And it's something we have in the US, a lifetime warranty on our product. But interestingly, it's something that consumers know very little about. And it's not in the mindset of a lot of consumers of textiles. And I think there's a role for brands and manufacturers to help almost re-socialize those ideas and make them more accessible. And then to Susannah's point about ease, we need to make this easy for consumers to do. To ensure that it's not a difficult journey if you want to get a product repaired or you want to recycle your packaging. How can we make that as easy as possible? Because consumers have a lot of things on their minds. We've got to appreciate their lives are not straightforward, and we have to make these things easy to access.
And I'd just like to round that out too, in alignment with what was just said. Remembering that it's anything in a market economy, supply and demand, certainly exists, and recycling is no different. So, there were comments earlier about having ready supply of the materials and products that then could be incorporated into their manufacturing process, and that supply will come certainly with more access and more education of, to the general population about what is not recyclable and how they can play their role, but absolutely demanding products that are made with recyclable inputs that are designed for recyclability. Then you get that perfect circle. And we always say there were other questions about enhancing collections or EPR schemes, things like that. But, we need to remember that unless there's demand for product, it's like any of these companies. If you don't have a customer, you're not going to make the product. And recycling is the same thing. If we don't have customers that need those recycled commodities to feed into their manufacturing supply chains, then the recycling isn't necessarily going to exist, no matter how much you collect. So I think it's for all of us. It's about those laws of supply and demand.
Yeah, if I could just jump in for a second too, I think everything everyone just said is totally agree with. I think also thinking about sort of the role of labeling as a piece of it and making sure it's very clear on the product or the package, what this is, where this should go. And really, from a product or a piece of packaging, thinking through from the very beginning, where is this going to go? How is it going to be used? So we can help encourage it getting in, being part of that circular loop. I talked a little bit about compostable products and some of the challenges there. And, it's maybe a little bit encouraging to see, companies that are sometimes hesitant to go into that compostable space because there isn't the infrastructure, because they want these products to be part of the circular economy, and sort of the role that companies who want to use these products can play in helping to encourage that end of life infrastructure to be in place. And that's something some of our members are doing through some of their work with us. But so just
I should have started by asking if any of you wish to discuss amongst each other questions from the first panel for the second panel, or vice versa for our second panel for our first. If any of you have any questions for each other, I do have another audience question to get to, but give you guys that open chance first. All right, not seeing anyone unmuting yet. So I have a big picture question, and Holim, I may start with you, but then hopefully maybe some others will jump in. So we had a couple of questions that came in. Talk about the larger global supply chains question. Is the actual movement of recycling and circular economy products around the world actually harming the environment because you're actually shipping more products around the world? Should there be more nearshoring? Certainly there are some things that need to be exported that are manufactured in one or a unique place, like medicines that need to be shipped around the world, and it's important that they fly on planes or on ships. We're even hearing stories about companies developing new wind-powered container ships in a way to reduce that. But is there a global trade problem with recycling in a way, and that the circular economy maybe as much as we want to do this, it also could end up costing the environment as well?
Okay, that's a very good question, but I think it would be a shame to think that trade, is not part of the answer, because trade is very much part of the answer. And even if we look at the tensions, if you like, and the difficulties between whether you have a global or whether you go completely national, if you like, and I think it's not feasible to go completely national. For many countries in the world, it's just simply not feasible for them. We hear from some members who are in some countries who are fairly small markets. They will always need to be global. They need to have an ability to connect to global markets. The reality of them producing everything at home is not feasible. It's also not necessarily very good for the environment because it's not very possible to produce this in an efficient or resource efficient way. They also have difficulties with waste. They generate waste themselves. And if they are told that they cannot be participating in the global flow of recycling, as was said by Adina and also by others, and part of the circular economy, they have big questions as to what do they do with the waste that they generate themselves. And they cannot build up the market to make circular economy work within their own market. So that's one very particular constraint. But even for large economies, I think it would be losing out, on the possible gains from trade, from participating in this larger market of efficiency. Because at the end of the day, what trade is about is about resource efficiency, a great part of it. That being said, there's also a big challenge, and I'm not trying to dismiss this. International trade itself has to, let's say, be better. It has to be greener, has to be better. Emissions do need to come down. And there are pathways to do that. And that is an important thing to take on board, be it through shipping, through aviation, through road transport. But that's a bigger societal change in production and consumption. It's not just about trade. And then it comes down to the other part, which I think the final one I would say is demand itself. As long as the demand is strong, and we do understand the demand is there, you have a choice. You either meet that demand, as you said, completely domestically, or you seek to meet the demand more globally. Meeting the demand completely domestically also has its own environmental difficulties and concerns and footprints. And it raises the question, is it an efficient way of doing it? I think, and this is a personal opinion, like with everything, it comes to a balance. There's a balance between, as we said, between getting the efficiency gains from trade and at the same time also ensuring that you meet other policy objectives and ensuring security of these supply chains. I think both dimensions are there. So it's not an either one or the other type of situation, in my view.
Ken, I'd just like to share a quick observation that there are folks who are not part of this conversation today who are doing great work in this space, but the World Economic Forum has looked at this question of, the sustainability benefits around recycling and resource recovery. The United Nations Environment Program has recent reports on resource efficiency, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So I think there are a lot of folks looking at this from different perspectives. And I haven't seen too much pushback on we shouldn't be encouraging the circularity and having international trade as part of that. I think the balancing that Ho Lim referred to is really in country, there are often limited opportunities for the efficient recovery of materials. And Adina is in a much better position to speak to this, but I'll just say that part of the challenge is the legal infrastructure has to help us get materials to the right places while still keeping them from going to the wrong places that really can't manage them well. And I share the optimism that Susannah has. I think we can right-size this over time, but we just need to understand we need adjustments to the trading scheme, both on the Basel and on the trade side.
That's great, Paul. Thank you. By the way, I texted the panel. They're willing to stay on for just an extra 5 minutes because we were running a little long and I'm about to wrap up, but I want to bounce one question back to Charlotte. We had a question come in about developing countries and LDCs. It's kind of a funny story, but when losing sports teams in the US, sometimes they print up T-shirts in advance of their game and they end up losing. So there's a lot of Atlanta Falcons win the Super Bowl T-shirts that never got to be worn in the United States, but were shipped off to some developing countries and are being worn around in those places. But is there more that the United States and other developed countries can be doing to help developing countries take part in the circular economy and be able to contribute positively?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you also for this question. I mean, as the example that I just explained with the EFTA and Indonesia being a developing country, EFTA, European industrialized countries, shows there is this disconnect between the industrialized economies and developing and emerging economies in this specific area of circular economy promotion, but also sustainable standards of sustainable production. I do think that trade can be part of the answer, or has to be part of the answer also for developing countries and emerging markets. And this kind of initiatives, as we've seen now with EFTA and Indonesia, are perhaps one tool to move in the right direction. Because what I was not able to say is that this partnership agreement actually includes knowledge transfer commitments from the EFTA states to Indonesia. It also includes technical support to the producers in Indonesia to achieve this kind of necessary standards in order to be able to trade palm oil. So it actually is a way how both parties, the industrialized parties and the developing parties, can benefit from such a trade arrangement. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And we love to tie everything back to global trade here at WITA. So thank you very much. We certainly hope that trade can be an answer to many of these questions. Any final words before we close up? I don't see from others. Sarah, want to say a couple last words before I say close here?
Sure. Well, just a huge thank you to both panels. The sheer, level of lack of technical difficulties is pretty good given the, two panels and the merge. I guess I would just say that, I think a lot more work needs to be done, obviously, based on the conversation that we're having. But I think that there was a lot of convergence that circular economy is our future, and we've got to be moving towards that. And we've got to be addressing head on some of the issues about how to deal with true waste versus, recycled products and commodities that are reusable. And we need to be thinking really critically about what is the right framework for doing that. And I think that we had a lot of great solutions put on the table today. I hope that as everybody's watching, both policymakers in the US and around the world and private sector and NGOs, that this has given you a lot of food for thought. And, I really hope to see some movement in these areas. So thank you, Ken, and thank you, WITA, and thanks to the panel.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all very much. Special thanks to Silverado Policy Accelerator, the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries for sponsoring our series of trade and the environment, and to the Plant-Based Products Council for sponsoring today's event. Thank you to all of our panelists. We're very grateful to you for making the time wherever you're coming from holiday, around the world. And as I've said on all our sessions in recent months, wherever you are in the world, if you are able to get the vaccine, please do so. It's the most important way we can move our countries and the economy and our people forward, is for you to get vaccinated if it's available to you. So please take care of yourself and take care of others by doing that. Thanks, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon.